Medieval battlefields weren't won by chivalry and shining armor. They were conquered by instruments of terrifying efficiency, each designed to exploit weaknesses in the enemy's defenses. Behind every victory stood not just brave knights, but the dark genius of weaponsmiths who transformed human fears into cold, hard metal. Let's start with the warhammer. This weapon embodied this brutal efficiency perfectly. Knights spent small fortunes on their plate armor, believing themselves nearly invincible on the battlefield. A well-crafted suit of armor could indeed turn away sword strikes and deflect arrows, leading many wealthy warriors to think they'd solved the problem of battlefield mortality. Then someone invented the warhammer, and suddenly that expensive metal shell became less protection and more of a personal coffin. Unlike swords that would harmlessly glance off plate armor, warhammers focused tremendous force into a small area. One solid hit could cave in a helmet and the skull underneath, without needing to penetrate the metal at all. The physics was brutal but effective. The energy had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was straight into the knight's brain. Knights probably thought they were getting the medieval equivalent of a tank, but ended up with something closer to a dinner bell. Ding! One crushed skull ready to serve. Many warhammers featured a wicked spike on the reverse side, turning the weapon into a versatile tool of destruction. Hammer side for crushing, spike side for puncturing. When your enemy wears a metal can, you simply need the right can opener. This design versatility made the warhammer a practical solution to the problem of heavily armored opponents. A knight might survive a sword blow thanks to his armor, but the concentrated force of a hammer strike transmitted through the metal would liquefy the tissue beneath. The horrifying sounds of a warhammer is connecting with a helmet, a distinctive crunch that signaled the end of a knight's career and often his life. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, English men-at-arms used warhammers to devastating effect against French knights who had become stuck in the muddy battlefield. Unable to maneuver effectively, these knights found their expensive armor transforming from protection into a death trap. What made warhammers particularly democratic weapons of their day was their accessibility. You didn't need years of training like with a sword. You just needed enough strength to swing it and enough anger to aim it at someone you didn't like. This made them popular among common soldiers who couldn't afford extensive combat training. It was perhaps history's first example of user-friendly design, though the user manual would have been disturbingly brief. Pointy end toward enemy, swing hard. Archaeological findings have uncovered warhammers with heads weighing up to 7 pounds, a significant mass when swung at the end of a 3-foot handle. The resulting momentum could easily crush bone, even through plate armor that would have stopped a sword or an arrow. Some specimens found in Eastern European collections show signs of repeated impact, with hammer faces worn smooth from use, silent testimony to the weapon's effectiveness. Interestingly, as armor improved throughout the medieval period, so did the warhammer. Earlier versions were little more than modified tools, but later designs became increasingly specialized for combat. By the 15th century, some warhammers featured armor-piercing spikes, reinforced shafts, and specially designed striking surfaces meant to punch through even the finest Milan steel. It was an arms race in miniature. As armor got better, hammers got deadlier. Knights spent years training in the chivalric arts, mastering swordsmanship and lance techniques, only to be taken down by a commoner with what amounted to an upgraded tool. There was something profoundly democratic about it. No matter your social status or wealth, your skull was equally crushable when facing a determined opponent with a warhammer. While the warhammer excelled at dealing with armored opponents through brute force, medieval weaponsmiths were just getting started with their deadly innovations. One of them is the spiked metal ball attached to a wooden handle by a length of chain. The flail represented medieval weapon design at its most unpredictable. This weapon couldn't have been more different from the straightforward warhammer. It was temperamental, difficult to master, and refused to follow the laws of physics in the way more conventional weapons did. If the warhammer was the reliable workhorse of medieval combat, the flail was its moody artistic cousin with anger management issues. The basic design was deceptively simple. Take a wooden handle, attach a chain, and secure a metal ball covered in spikes to the other end. But this simplicity masked a weapon of terrifying complexity in actual use. The chain created a delay between the wielder's movement and the impact of the striking head, making timing extraordinarily difficult to master. Many medieval manuscripts describe the lengthy training required to use a flail effectively, with novices spending months learning to avoid striking themselves before ever facing an opponent. Medieval weapon instructors must have had the easiest job interviews. Self-injury was remarkably common among flail users. Historical records from military hospitals across medieval Europe document numerous injuries sustained during flail training. Modern experimental archaeologists attempting to master flail techniques have confirmed it, with many suffering bruises, lacerations, and even broken bones during practice sessions. The flail has the unique distinction of being the only medieval weapon with a confirmed kill count against its own users. A flail user needed to develop not just strength, but a keen spatial awareness and precise control over the weapon's momentum, or at least enough awareness to draft a will before practice sessions. Given these challenges, why would anyone choose such a difficult weapon? The answer lies in its unique advantages against the heavily armored opponents of the late medieval period. The flexible chain allowed the striking head to bypass shields and other defensive implements that would have stopped a rigid weapon like a sword or mace. A shield raised to block a flail could still result in the spiked ball wrapping around its edge to strike the defender. This unpredictability made the flail particularly effective against defensive fighters who relied on precise blocking techniques. Your shield technique is impeccable, Sir Knight. Anyway, here's a spiky surprise coming in from a completely different angle. The physics of the flail also gave it tremendous striking power. The chain acted as a force multiplier, creating a whip-like effect that concentrated energy into the striking head. Tests conducted on modern reproductions have shown that a flail can deliver up to 40% more force than a rigid weapon of similar weight. When this force was combined with the armor-piercing potential of the spikes, the result was a weapon capable of causing catastrophic injuries even to armored opponents. Medieval knights learned the hard way that momentum wasn't just a fancy physics term, it was what turned their expensive armor into an elaborate colander. Multiple variations of the flail existed throughout medieval Europe. The most common was the single-headed military flail with a spiked iron ball, but more exotic versions have been documented in historical texts and artwork. Some flails featured multiple chains and striking heads, transforming the already chaotic weapon into something even more unpredictable. Because nothing says, "I have a death wish," quite like doubling down on an already uncontrollable weapon. A particularly notorious variant from Eastern Europe incorporated small hollow chambers in the striking heads that produced a terrifying whistling sound when swung. This psychological weapon added an element of terror to an already fearsome device, disorienting opponents before impact. It was the medieval version of psychological warfare. Is that whistling sound getting closer? Or, oh, there's a hole in my helmet now. The flail gained a reputation as a weapon that required special countermeasures. Knights trained specifically to deal with flail wielders, learning to predict the arc of the striking head and time their movements to avoid its deadly impact. These specialized techniques highlight how seriously the threat of the flail was taken on medieval battlefields. While less common than swords or spears, flails occupied a special place in a knight's nightmare, a weapon whose movement could not be easily predicted or countered. Knights probably had PTSD flashbacks every time they heard a chain rattle or watched someone swing a bag of groceries. The flail's reputation extended beyond the battlefield. In several European regions, it became associated with peasant uprisings due to its agricultural origins. The military flail evolved from the grain flail, a farming tool used to separate grain from husks. During times of rebellion, peasants often modified these familiar tools into weapons, creating folk variants of the military flail. These makeshift weapons proved surprisingly effective against armored opponents, contributing to the success of several peasant revolts throughout the medieval period. Talk about workplace repurposing. One day you're threshing wheat, the next day you're threshing nobles. The Hussite rebels of 15th century Bohemia became particularly infamous for their effective use of flails against fully armored opponents. The unpredictable movement of the striking head made defensive maneuvers difficult to time correctly. Even experienced knights might find themselves hesitating in the face of a weapon that defied standard defensive tactics. This moment of hesitation could prove fatal on the battlefield, where split-second decisions often determine survival. The flail created existential crises on the battlefield. Is the spiked ball coming at my face, or wait, where did it go? Oh, there it is, somehow behind me. While the warhammer brought direct crushing force to deal with armored opponents, the flail introduced an element of chaos that even the most heavily armored knight had reason to fear. But for all its unpredictability, the flail still required a trained warrior to wield it effectively. Other weapons would emerge that placed deadly force. The Godendag, a Flemish term meaning good day, represents one of history's most effective examples of straightforward weapon design. This unassuming weapon changed the course of medieval warfare by placing deadly power in the hands of common soldiers. At first glance, a Godendag appears almost primitive, a stout wooden club with a single metal spike protruding from the end. Nothing about its appearance suggests the revolutionary impact it would have on European battlefields. Yet this simple design concealed a tactical versatility that made it devastating against even the most heavily armored opponents. The effectiveness of the Godendag stemmed from its dual-purpose design. The spike could puncture armor or unseat mounted knights, while the heavy club portion delivered crushing blows to opponents who had been knocked to the ground. This combination made it the perfect weapon for foot soldiers facing armored cavalry, a common scenario in medieval warfare. The weapon's defining moment came at the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, commonly known as the Battle of the Golden Spurs. On July 11th of that year, an army of Flemish townspeople and peasants faced a force of French knights, the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. The French were so confident of victory that they brought along a special wagon filled with ropes to bind their expected prisoners. What happened next shocked the medieval world. The Flemish militia, armed primarily with Godendags, utterly destroyed the French knights. The battlefield was so littered with golden spurs, a symbol of knighthood, that the conflict gained its alternative name. How did an army of commoners defeat Europe's premier fighting force? The genius of the Godendag lay in its application against mounted knights. Flemish fighters developed a specific technique: brace the base of the weapon against the ground, pointing the spike upward toward an oncoming horse. The charging knight, carried forward by his own momentum, would impale either himself or his mount on the spike. Once dismounted, the knight became vulnerable to the club end of the weapon, which could crush skulls even through helmets. This battle revealed a harsh truth about medieval warfare. Even the most sophisticated armor and years of training could be undone by a determined opponent with the right tool. The Godendag cost perhaps 1/50th the price of a knight's equipment, yet proved more decisive on that bloody field. Military historians mark Courtrai as the beginning of the end for the dominance of heavy cavalry in European warfare. Surviving examples of Godendags show remarkable variation in size and design. Some featured shorter handles for tight formation fighting, while others extended to nearly 6 feet in length for front-rank troops. The spike might be short and pyramidal or long and slender, depending on its intended use against different types of armor. This variation suggests that, despite its simple appearance, the Godendag underwent continuous refinement based on battlefield experience. For centuries, knights had cultivated an image of martial superiority, with elaborate codes of combat and expensive equipment serving as barriers to entry for common soldiers. The Godendag shattered this mystique by proving that a simple weapon in trained hands could overcome aristocratic advantages. After Courtrai, chronicles record a notable change in how nobles spoke about infantry, with newfound respect tinged with fear. Manufacturing a Godendag required minimal resources and expertise compared to more complex weapons. A village blacksmith could produce the metal spike, while any competent woodworker could fashion the club portion. This accessibility made it possible for entire communities to arm themselves quickly during times of conflict. During the Flemish revolt against French rule, historical records indicate that towns could outfit hundreds of militia members with these weapons in a matter of weeks. The Godendag also influenced military training methods. Unlike swords or flails that required years to master, effective use of the Godendag could be taught to recruits in days. Military documents from the period describe drilling formations of Godendag wielders to create an interlocking wall of spikes against cavalry charges. This standardized training transformed groups of individual fighters into coordinated units capable of standing against mounted knights. The weapon's legacy extends beyond the medieval period. The concept of combining piercing and crushing elements in a single infantry weapon influenced polearm design for centuries. Later weapons like the halberd and pollux incorporated similar principles, but with more elaborate construction. Even as these more sophisticated designs emerged, the Godendag remained in use among militia forces well into the 16th century, a testament to its enduring effectiveness. The rise of firearms would eventually render most medieval melee weapons obsolete, including the Godendag. Yet this simple weapon had already changed warfare by proving that technological advantage didn't always require complexity or expense. Sometimes the most revolutionary tools are also the most straightforward, a lesson that military innovators continue to rediscover. While the Godendag empowered common soldiers with its simplicity, other medieval weapons took the opposite approach. The Zweihänder embodied extravagant excess. This enormous two-handed sword dominated battlefields through its sheer imposing presence and the devastating power it delivered in the hands of skilled warriors. If the warhammer was medieval problem-solving through brute force and the flail was medieval chaos theory in action, the Zweihänder was medieval overcompensation in weapon form. Zweihänder translates from German as two-hander, a straightforward name for a weapon that was anything but simple. These massive swords measured between 5 and 6 feet long, with some exceptional specimens reaching nearly 7 feet. The blade alone could extend over 4 feet, with a grip long enough to accommodate both hands with room to spare. These weren't just big swords, they were portable siege weapons disguised as blades. When your sword is taller than most of the people you're fighting, you're not just making a statement about your combat style, but possibly compensating for something else entirely. The weight of a typical Zweihänder ranged from 7 to 14 pounds, with most battlefield versions falling closer to the lighter end of that spectrum. This might not sound particularly heavy until you consider the exhaustion of swinging such a weapon repeatedly during combat. Modern martial arts tests with authentic Zweihänders have shown that even trained athletes struggle to maintain effective fighting form for more than a few minutes. The physical demands placed on historical users must have been extraordinary. These warriors didn't need two hands just because the manual said so. They needed them because otherwise their arms would have fallen off after the third swing. German mercenaries known as Landsknechts specialized in wielding these enormous weapons. These professional soldiers emerged in the late 15th century and quickly gained a reputation as some of Europe's most effective fighters. Within Landsknecht formations, Zweihänder wielders received double pay due to the skill and strength required to use the weapon effectively, earning them the title Doppelsöldner, or double pay men. This financial incentive drew the biggest and strongest recruits to train with the massive swords. Medieval job descriptions didn't get more straightforward. Must have 2 functioning hands, forearms like tree trunks, and a complete disregard for reasonable weapon proportions. Double salary, triple food rations. Primary sources describe the specialized role these sword wielders played on the battlefield. Rather than fighting in conventional formations, Zweihänder users often operated as formation breakers, charging directly into opposing pike squares to disrupt their cohesion. The long reach of the Zweihänder allowed its user to cut through multiple pike shafts with a single powerful swing, creating gaps that could be exploited by following troops. Pike formations, previously considered nearly impenetrable, suddenly had a counter-weapon to fear. Imagine the horror of watching someone charge your impenetrable formation with what amounted to a 6-foot razor blade. It was like bringing a metal tree to a stick fight. The design of the Zweihänder evolved significantly throughout its service life. Early versions resembled oversized longswords, but later models incorporated specialized features for battlefield effectiveness. Most notable was the addition of a ricasso, an unsharpened section of blade just above the crossguard, often wrapped in leather to provide an additional gripping surface. This feature allowed for more controlled handling, with the wielder placing one hand on the grip and the other on the ricasso for leverage in close combat. When your sword is so big it needs its own handle halfway up the blade, you might have taken the two hands concept a bit too literally. Many Zweihänders also featured parrying hooks or flukes projecting from the blade near the crossguard. These secondary guards served multiple purposes. They protected the user's hands, provided additional leverage for controlling an opponent's weapon, and could be used to trap and disarm enemies during combat. These hooks transformed the sword from a pure cutting tool into a multi-purpose battlefield implement that could slash, thrust, hook, and trap enemy weapons. It was the medieval Swiss Army knife, if that knife were 6 feet long and required Olympic-level strength to lift. One military observer noted how enemy formations would visibly recoil at the approach of Landsknechts carrying these enormous swords. The distinctive profile of the Zweihänder, especially when carried upright with the blade resting on the shoulder, created an impression of superhuman warriors that could demoralize opponents before battle even began. Half the battle was psychological. When you see someone casually resting what looks like an entire blacksmith shop on their shoulder, running in the opposite direction suddenly seems like a career-enhancing move. Training with the Zweihänder required specialized techniques unlike those used with smaller swords. Surviving fighting manuals illustrate specific stances and movements designed to manage the weapon's momentum rather than fight against it. Users learn to flow from one strike to another, maintaining constant motion to avoid becoming vulnerable during recovery. A properly trained Zweihänder wielder moved with a dancer's precision, transforming the unwieldy blade into an extension of their body. Medieval Zweihänder training manuals likely began with an important disclaimer. Results may vary based on how many times you've skipped arm day. At the Battle of Bicaka in 1522, Landsknechts armed with Zweihänders carved paths through dense Swiss pike formations that had previously been considered unbreakable. The psychological shock of seeing their invincible pike walls devastated by these enormous swords contributed to a significant Swiss defeat and marked a turning point in infantry tactics. The Swiss pikemen learned an important lesson that day. When the enemy brings a sword so big it needs its own zip code, your unbreakable formation is about to experience some unscheduled renovations. Despite their effectiveness, Zweihänders remained specialist weapons rather than standard issue equipment. The extensive training requirements, physical demands, and material costs limited their distribution to elite troops. A quality Zweihänder required significant quantities of high-grade steel and the skills of master swordsmiths, making them expensive investments even for well-funded mercenary companies. When your weapon costs as much as a small house and requires the muscle development of a professional athlete, mass production isn't really an option. These massive swords remained in active military use longer than might be expected, with documented battlefield deployments continuing into the early 17th century, well into the age of firearms. This longevity speaks to their continued effectiveness even as military technology evolved around them. The Zweihänder found particular use in defending narrow passages like breaches in city walls, where their long reach and devastating cutting power could hold back multiple attackers. Nothing said, "This doorway is closed," quite like a man with a sword the size of a small tree standing in the breach. Surviving examples display remarkable craftsmanship alongside their intimidating dimensions. Museum specimens often feature elaborate etching, gilded inscriptions, and complex hilts that showcase the prestige associated with these weapons. The classic Zweihänder silhouette became a status symbol among mercenary companies, with ornately decorated examples serving as parade weapons and symbols of unit pride. Some were so elaborately decorated that they probably spent more time being admired than used in battle, the medieval equivalent of that sports car that never leaves the garage. While the Zweihänder represented the height of offensive capability through sheer size and reach, medieval weapon designers also created specialized tools for more selective battlefield tasks. Medieval battlefields were not always about killing. Sometimes capturing an opponent alive offered far greater rewards than simply adding another body to the pile. Enter the man-catcher, a weapon specifically designed not to end lives, but to ensure prisoners remained both alive and compliant. Because sometimes killing your enemies wasn't enough, you needed to invoice them afterward.